Good day everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Structure Deck Scrutiny, the series where we dissect Konami's pre-built decks and see how well they live up to the billing as easy ways into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Last week we took a look at one of the most beloved decks from the early batch of Structure decks, in Fury from the Deep. At the end of that episode, I said that for the first time we were going to cover two good decks in a row, so here we are with Warrior's Triumph. So as the name suggests, this deck will primarily focus on warrior monsters, which at this time, and in many other times since, were the best type of monsters you could be playing in Yu-Gi-Oh! So with that being said, you think this would be an S-tier deck, right? A deck to rival Zombie Madness or Fear from the Deep? You know, of all the best warrior monsters, a few extra cards, and a good stepping stone to Warrior Toolbox? Well, we kinda got there and kind of didn't. It's a bit complicated, but I'll explain in this video. Yes, we do get many of the best warriors in Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time, and this deck does indeed provide a decent starting point for building Warrior Toolbox. However, the problem is that that's only about a third of the deck. In addition to the usual Structure deck bulk, Konami decided to add a sub-theme to this deck and pack it full of equip cards along with two boss monsters that synergize with equips. Now in theory this could still work, but the problem is Konami didn't exactly give us the pick of the armory here, with quite a few useless or underpowered equips to deal with. As usual, let's begin this look back with a look at the deck's cover card, Guilford the Legend, and thank God it doesn't require something like Guilford the Lightning to summon him. A 2-tribute monster, Guilford cannot be special summoned, and when he is tribute summoned he can take any equip card from your graveyard and equip it to any valid target on the field. I'll be honest, this might be the best boss monster we've seen in this series so far. Like the Flame Emperor, he's easy to summon, but he also has an effect that synergizes very well with the rest of the deck and helps fix one of its biggest weaknesses, that being that equip cards are a -1 usually in card advantage, because if the monster they're attached to dies, they go with it, meaning that a card like for example Ring of Destruction is now a +1, so an equip card either needs to go to the opponent's monsters like Snatch Steal, or be extremely powerful like Mage Power or United We Stand to see play. So because of this, Guilford, essentially a sword charge for equip cards, does have to get around the deck's natural flaws without being too OP. So we're off to a good start here, and hey, the deck technically has another powerful boss monster, who I'm sure is equally as good, right? Right? Oh yeah. Gearfried the Swordmaster is a 2600 attack monster, and he actually has a really powerful effect, which states that whenever a card is equipped to him, he can destroy one monster the opponent controls. So a powerful warrior that works well with equips, what's the problem? The fact that he requires a specific monster to summon, a monster that can't be equipped by the way, because why have good synergy when you can have lore? But to add insult to injury, you also need to play a brick of a spell for the privilege of summoning this guy. So to sum it up, we have two boss monsters, one decent, one awful, that are both only here to force the equip theme, and like most of the equips in this deck, we're taking them out upon upgrading. However, now that we've got the two underwhelming boss monsters out of the way, I will say that the rest of this deck's monsters are for the most part really good. First up we got not one, but two copies of Marauding Captain, which in a warrior deck is very important, as not only have we got a card that can help us swarm the field, but he'll also protect our other monsters in battle, as the captain allows us to summon any level 4 or lower warrior from our hand on summon, and he also guards them once they're out, as he is the only monster the opponent can attack while he's on the field. Also yes, this deck does come with two copies of this card, so we can set up the captain lock to prevent attacks, period. Which may be important, as structured decks around this time didn't exactly have much in terms of recovery, so a way to prolong the game when you get back into it was very important. Next up we have two of the best warriors as well as two of the best cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time, in Exiled Force and DD Warrior Lady. Some of the strongest removal in the game at the time, Force could be attributed to destroy one monster on the field, while Warrior Lady could banish any monster she battled, as well as herself. Simple yet effective, these two monsters, often accompanied by a rotor, were staples in many decks at the time, as they were among the best ways to remove powerful boss monsters like BLS, Chaos Sork, and the Monarch monsters. Now Force was fairly cheap at this time anyway, but Warrior Lady only had a couple of prints at this time, so this mass reprint was very much welcome back then for many players, particularly those looking to play more aggressive decks that became more viable once Goat Control took a hit on the ban list that came up before this deck's release. Next up we have a few more monsters that while not universal staples were essentially in the warrior strategies of the time, starting with Mataza the Zapper, who not only can attack twice each turn, but whose control cannot be changed, meaning he cannot be snatch stealed. This actually makes him one of the best targets to put our equip cards onto, because not only can you potentially one-shot the opponent with 2 attacks, but there's less chance for opponents stealing all those cards with 1 snatch steal. We also have the Mystic Swordman cards with level 2 and 4, which one of the most powerful warriors in 2's case were both used for the same purpose, to take out monsters without triggering their flip effects. Now granted, after Goat got hit on the ban list, Monarch and Warrior decks became the 2 top decks, and flip monsters weren't as common anymore, but these cards would still do a lot of work in the right hands. In a similar vein, we got a copy of Ninja Grandmaster Suzuki, which along with having a good body, also can remove face-up defense position monsters. Again, not as many targets as there were in Goat, but there was still enough that these cards could have seen a lot of play. Next up, we have Gearfried the Iron Knight, and don't let his counterpart fool you because Gearfried is actually a decent card. An 1800 beat stick, Gearfried has a simple effect. He can't be equipped, and any card equipped to him will immediately be destroyed. Yes, I'll let that sink in for a second. The equipped deck has a monster that can't be equipped. Sounds bad, right? Well, if any of the equips are worth playing, maybe, but since most of them are not, it's not really that big a deal. What makes Gearfried a good card is mostly the fact that he can't be snatch stealed, which can sometimes be enough to steal a game, especially in late 05 and early 06, when Monarchs begin to take over. In addition to this card's anti-equip effect had some synergy within this deck, as there were a couple of equips, most notably Smoke Grenade of the Thief, but also Blast Out by Chain, that get effects off when they are destroyed. In fact, there's a whole subset of warrior decks in GOAT and in 2006 format that rely on Gearfried's effect for this purpose. Next up we have the new monster in this deck, Warrior Lady of the Wasteland, who is the warrior entry in the Recruiter family. The typical recruiter for the time, Lady upon being destroyed by battle, summons any warrior with 1500 or less attack from the deck. Now I don't know if you've noticed this, but this gives us access to a lot of good removal in DD Warrior Lady and Exiled Force, Marauding Captain for protection and spamming, as we'll soon see, an OTK enabler. Honestly, I do think this is probably the best recruiter outside of Pyramid Turtle we've got in these decks. Finally, in terms of meta-relevant monsters, we have Armed Samurai Benkei, who not only has his own deck built around him in GOAT format, but is the final equipped synergy monster in this deck, as he can attack an extra time for each card equipped to him, meaning this is technically the first structure deck that can OTK, as unlikely as it is. In all honesty, this is not the best card in the warrior beatdown strategy, however I'm glad he's in this deck for reasons I mentioned in the upgrade section. Now the rest of these monsters aren't exactly the greatest for competitive purposes, but most aren't terrible either. For example, we have Commander Knight, a level 4 that gives all warriors a 400 point boost, and has a reverse captain effect, where it can't be attacked if you control another warrior. Honestly not a bad card, just one whose stats are a bit too weak to be useful. We also have Dark Blade and Goblin Attack Force, who are simply big beaters that aren't amazing, but in a beatdown strategy like this, they're perfectly serviceable before we inevitably remove them in the upgrading process. In fact, outside of the Swordmaster, the only monsters in this deck I would call outright bad were given to us courtesy of Yukimoto himself, with Obnoxious Celtic Guardian and Swift Gaia the Fierce Knight. Now Guardian's effect isn't the worst, in that he cannot be disrupting monsters with more than 900 attack, meaning he can tank a hit from things like BLS and the Monarchs, as well as a few big level 4s like Breaker with a counter or Berserk Gorilla. However, there were just too many monsters heavily played this time that could take this guy out with one shot, like Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, Breaker without a counter, a Soda Priest, etc. Last and definitely least is Gaia, and what can I even say about this guy? He's a 2300 vanilla basically that you can summon for free if you've got no cards in your hand. I mean, I guess it's a decent body, but if you're that low on resources, it's probably not going to save you, and if you aren't hellbent, there's literally just Gaia, the vanilla version, who was even good back in 2002. Definitely the first card to get cut from this deck upon upgrading. In terms of the spells in this deck, we'll cover most of them in the reprint section, because most of the ones we're talking about don't synergize with the warrior theme, but are merely just good cards. But there are 2 cards that do deserve mention in this section, Reinforcements of the Army and the Warrior Returning Alive. As with 2 rotors being able to search most of our deck, and Alive being able to add monsters back to our hand, this deck has a level of consistency and comeback ability not seen in many decks out of the box. Now we also have a copy of Release Restraint in this deck, which allows us to go into Swordmaster, but again, despite him working well with the equip themes in this deck, I just don't think it's worth playing this brick. And speaking of which, let's get to the equips, shall we? Now, like I said, we haven't got the cream of the crop here in terms of armaments, and this is largely because this is the one area of the deck that chooses flavour over function, as it made all of our equipped cards swords, most of which are either out of place in this deck or just underwhelming in terms of power. Starting with the new cards in this deck, we have Divine Sword, Phoenix Blade, which gives our warriors a pretty poor 300 point boost. However, it makes up for this with its second effect, which allows us to add it back from grave to hand if we banish 2 warriors from the graveyard, an effect that is not once per turn, by the way. Now, admittedly in this deck this card isn't great, merely a slow way to recur resources to make somewhat of a comeback late game. However, this card has on multiple occasions been played in meta-relevant decks, from the 2007 DDT deck that relied on spamming a bunch of spells with Diamond Dude, to the 4 Armageddon Knight a turn Dark Warrior in 2018. There's a lot of cards that banishes multiple times a turn can do for you, and thus it has seen several stints of relevancy over the years, and has often been called to be banned at certain points. Up next is one of the best cards from one of the game's worst decks, in Wicked Breaking Flameburge Bow, which, in addition to granting a 500 point boost, also negates the effects of any monster the equipped card destroys in battle. Now again, there weren't as many good targets for this in the late 2005 as there were in GOAT format, so unlike Dark Ruler as a tech in GOAT, this would be shutting down many flip effects. However, it can still do a lot of work by stopping Sangan and other floaters from searching, DD Warrior Lady from bashing our big monsters, and the flip cards that we're still seeing play like Magician of Faith and Morphing Jar from triggering. So not a horrible effect, but there is one thing that almost kills this card, and that's the fact that you discard 1 monster to activate it. As see, this deck can't really afford to be discarding its monsters willy-nilly, as it struggles to keep its hand full anyway. Such a shame, because it's got a lot of potential, but I think this cost makes it unusable, I'm afraid. Now, Bow wasn't great, but it had some potential, which more than can be said for our last 2 equips in Lightning Blade and Fusion Sword, both granting 800 point buffs, which isn't horrible. However, both of them have such minor upsides other than these buffs that it really isn't worth playing them over cards like Mage Power and Unity Withstand if all you want is a big monster. Fusion Sword can't be destroyed by card effects, which is usually a very powerful effect to have, and it does mean this card can't be MST'd or Heavy Stormed. It also means it can be used alongside Gearfried. However, it's still an equip, so that effect is useless if the monster is taken out instead of the sword. But still, that's leagues better than Lightning Blade, whose only additional benefit is reducing water monsters by 500 attack. Attack against Fury from the Deep, I guess? I got nothing with this one, I'm afraid. Finally, in our equip synergies, we have Fairy of the Spring, basically a Magician of Faith for equip cards. It lets us take an equip from our graveyard and put it back in our hands. Again, not a bad effect to have, somewhat like a warrior turning alive for the equip part of the deck. However, Fairy of the Spring has a line of text that still baffles me. You can't use the equip the turn you activate it. So yeah, basically this equip focused card is worse with equips than Magician of Faith, a card that's not in this deck and has no synergy with equips or warriors. Finally, we have the trap section. However, there's only 4 traps in this deck, and 3 are saved for the reprint section, so there's not much to talk about here. However, there is one card I do want to cover, and that's Blast held by a chain. A normal trap, Blast acts like an equip card on activation, and grants the monster it's equipped to a 500 point boost. However, the real power of this card is when it's sent to the graveyard, as when it does, it explodes on destruction and takes a monster with it. Now, this is the main reason we have Gearfried in this deck, as the blast will immediately slide right off him and be an instant removal effect. And it also makes our other monsters tricky to remove, as our opponent needs to give one of their own to take out a monster equipped with Blast. In fact, this is actually a variant of Warrior Toolbox in GOAT format built around Gearfried, which uses cards like Blast and the aforementioned Smoke Raid of the Thief to basically gain advantage of destroying their own equips. Again, not as popular as a standard Warrior Toolbox, but definitely an interesting take on the deck. In fact, the only complaint I have about this card in this deck is the fact that it's not an equip when it's in the graveyard, meaning Guildford can't recycle it, but maybe that's for the best. This deck's already pretty powerful and we don't need recyclable removal. Overall, a decent equip for this deck, and a good way to end this segment, I think. Overall, despite a few hiccups, I think that this is one of the best out-of-the-box structure decks we've covered on this series. Like I said, Warrior Toolbox was already arguably the best deck around this time, and this deck gave players a toned-down version of it that could easily be upgraded into the real thing if players liked it. It gave them everything they needed to get started in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time, from good beaters to decent removal options, and even its boss monsters weren't that bad, at least compared to most of the dregs we've covered on this series so far. While it is true that the equip sub-theme didn't really work out in this deck, and I will dock points for that, I don't think there was enough of them to severely hamper the deck's playability. I think an A- is fair here, with the equips being the only thing keeping this deck from a full-on A. Now let's move on to see what this deck can do in its fully upgraded form, shall we? When it comes to upgrading this deck, this might actually be the deck with the best upgrade paths, as it gives us not one but two competitive decks, with Warrior Toolbox being a top 4 deck in GOAT, and possibly the best deck in late 2005 when this deck came out, as well as Benkei OTK, which was a rogue option around the time of the deck's release. Now I have go from a guide on both of these decks, and if you can stand the bad audio in guide number 2, I'd highly recommend watching them for an in-depth breakdown of these decks. However, I'll still go with them a little bit here. I think we'll begin with Old Ben first, as it's the easier one to talk about, being a more simple deck. Also, it's quite cool that you can build this deck out of some of the cards in this deck, and still have most of the pieces left for Warrior Toolbox afterwards. An interesting take on an OTK strategy, Benkei worked by summoning the overburdened samurai and putting at least 2 powerful equips onto him, then using his effect to attack a number of extra times equal to the amount of equips he had, hopefully doing enough damage to one-shot an opponent. To set this up, we use cards like Gravity Bind and Level with Area B to build our combo, and to make sure our attacks could get through, we also run cards like Heavy Storm and Giant Trunade. A very simple strategy, and one that could be built with 2 structure decks, in this and Blaze of Destruction, as all your monster equips and back row hate can come from here, while the stall cards came from Blaze. Then it was just a matter of getting more powerful equips like Mage Power, Axe of Despair and United We Stand to fully upgrade, and boom, one of the cheapest, somewhat meta decks of 2005. When it comes to the other deck that can be made from this structure deck, Warrior Toolbox, we did need to invest a bit more into non-structure deck products to fully make it, but not by much. So again, we have a good deck, a top tier one this time, that can be put together for around $60 thanks to this structure deck. Firstly, we need to max out on Marauding Captain, Mataza the Zapper, Mystic Swordsman level 2 and Ninja Grandmaster, which, as I explained in my GOAT guide, are like 90% of a warrior strategy from around this time. In fact, the only warriors played heavily in this deck that we can't get from the base structure deck are Blade Knight, Don Zalug and DD Assailant, and 2 of those were fairly easy to get, with Knight being a tin promo at the time and Assailant being a video game promo, so the only downside again this cow is that you had to buy a horrible video game to do it. So that means the only card here that we can't get super easy was Don Zalug, and even he wasn't too pricey at the time, having received a reprint about a couple of months before this deck came out. Add in extra copies of Warrior Lady of the Wasteland, which would have been pennies to get back in the day, and then max out on the good back row included in this deck, and bam, you've got more or less a top tier deck that's like a fifth of the cost of the other best decks at the time in Monarch and Chaos. Overall, Warrior's Triumph is absolutely a triumph when it comes to its upgrade paths, being the first deck to be able to make multiple somewhat competitive decks, and also severely dropping the price of one of the best decks in the game at the time, and making top tier competitive play much more affordable for a much wider range of players in 2006. An easy A+. Finally, let's look at the reprints this deck has to offer. Now, we already covered the best reprints in the monster section, as both DD Warrior Lady and Exile Force were essentially must-have staples at the time in 90% of decks, and many of those decks also played Roto to search these staples. However, we still have a lot of other good cards to talk about, mostly in terms of the back row. But there is one monster not covered much yet that I think deserves a little bit more of a mention. Goblin Attack Force, which is the only reprint not running some kind of warrior deck, is a level 4 monster with 2300 attack, which are massive stats for a level 4 even in this day and age. However, the catch is that he switched to defense after attacking, and can't be changed back the next turn. So an OK beater whose downside seems to make it not worth running in this warrior deck, Force did see play in another deck around this time, and that deck was Skill Drain Beatdown, which played cards like the Goblin along with Chainsaw Insect and the aforementioned Floodgate to play big monsters that were easy to summon with some downsides and just ignore those downsides. Not exactly a meta viable deck, but it was a fairly decent budget option and a very simple deck for new players at the time, so I think this was a decent reprint here. We already discussed the roster reprint when it came to the spells, but there's a lot more to talk about here. In addition to the usual staples that we always see reprinted at this time, like Pot of Greed, Snatch Steel and Heavy Storm, we also have Giant Trunade, a card that admittedly didn't see too much competitive play at the time, but has seen experimentation in recent years in GOAT, especially in highly aggressive decks like Warrior and Benkei, as there's basically another Heavy Storm in those decks, as if we're winning in that turn, we don't really care where the opponent's back row is as long as it's not on the field causing us problems. Another powerful staple gets its first reprint here in Lightning Vortex. As I've mentioned in several videos on this channel, one thing mostly absent in Yu-Gi-Oh! Around this time was a good board wipe, as both Raigeki and Dark Hole were banned and wouldn't be released for many years. As such, in early 2005 we got this card in Flaming Eternity, which destroys all face-up monsters the opponent controls at the cost of a discard. Now, in an age where Raigeki and Dark Hole are at 3 and don't see play, I know this card looks bad, but trust me, at the time this is one of the most played and sought after cards in the game, as it's the only way outside of Mirror Force to fully clear a field. I can't remember how much this card was upon its first print, but I do vividly remember being very excited for this deck as a kid, mostly because of this reprint, so it must be a little pricey at least. When it came to trap reprints, we still got the Call of the Haunted reprint, which is always welcome. However, for some reason we didn't get the Destroyer reprint we usually get. Now, given another reprint we'll talk about in a second, I can guess why it's not included. And to be fair, Giant Trunade is a far stronger card to get in its place. I wanted to note it here because it's an absence of a card that's been a staple in this series since the beginning. The only other notable trap we have in this deck is actually our first Floodgate in this series, in Royal Decree, a trap card that stops all other traps from activating. Now, while this card isn't exactly a staple card around this time, it has recently started to see play in GOAT in some aggro decks, most notably zombie variants and of course a few warrior decks. For you see, while the majority of aggro decks from around this time prefer cards like Compulse and Solemn Judgment to clear the way for attacks, others have realised that an opponent that can't play either of those or any battle trap like Mirror Force is usually much easier to take out. So in conclusion, the highest standard of reprints in these decks continues, and thanks to the warrior theme, we even got a few generic reprints that we hadn't seen before, making this deck arguably the best you could have back then for staples. A+ for damn sure. Overall, I feel that Warrior's Triumph is among the most underappreciated decks of the original 10 structures, and one that, if it wasn't for the unnecessary equips, would easily rival Zombie Madness and Veering from the Deep in terms of power. Join us next time when we start our journey to structure deck hell as we look at Spellcaster's Judgment. See you guys soon.